Welcome to Personally Speaking. I'm your host, Msgr Jim Lisante. Scott Gegerson is my guest this week, who took personal heartbreak and transformed it into loving service. Please stay with us. Hello and welcome to Personally Speaking. I'm your host, Msgr Jim Lisante, and Scott Gegerson joins me now. Scott is a certified financial planner and president of Trivium Wealth Management. He'll be speaking with us about losing loved ones and turning grief into a life of service and helping others. Scott is very involved with the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, and he'll talk to us about that and the importance of raising awareness about blood cancers. Scott is also the father to his daughter Ella and son Jack. He's here with us today to talk about the faith and values that matter the most to him, how the loss of his parents changed his outlook on life, and how he's healing by helping others. Joining me now, I'm so pleased to welcome to Personally Speaking, Scott Gegerson. Scott, thank you for coming on our program. And let me just ask you from the outset, everybody deals with grief and loss in different ways. Your initial response when you recognized you had lost mom and then ultimately dad, how did you grieve? Was there a right or wrong way for you to grieve? Did you go for help in terms of trying to figure out, what do I do with my sadness? Tell us about the experience of grief when you lose two people who are so central to your life as your mom and dad.
Sure. So as you know, Monsignor, I lost both of my parents to blood cancer within about 3 years of each other. And grief's a funny thing. I think it's kind of like one of those things that you don't really know that you're in it until after the fact. And when my mother first got diagnosed and was going through treatment and ultimately passed, I didn't really have much time to grieve. I found myself so involved in the medical aspect of it, and trying to do the next thing to prolong her life, that grief really wasn't an option for me. When she passed, it kind of took on a whole new meaning, because I felt the need to kind of take care of my family, take care of my father, take care of my sister, and fill the role or the void that my mom left. She was a very commanding person and a wonderful leader, and she was, the matriarch and sometimes the patriarch of the family as well. So I kind of slipped into that role, and grief for me was more so, helping others and helping out my family.
Now, how long was Lorraine, your mom, how long was she sick for before she passed?
So from the time she was diagnosed, which was probably in the fall of 2017, she passed in August of 2018. So
Okay.
just shy of a year, about 10 months.
Did you know from the outset that it probably would not end happily, or did you always have hope?
I always had hope.
Yeah.
We didn't know her diagnosis and her cancer, her disease was very treatable. She had to go through a bone marrow transplant, and she went through that procedure and even the recovery thereafter very well. She contracted a virus with a very suppressed immune system, which ultimately she didn't survive. So yeah, throughout, up until maybe about a week or so, until she passed, we were very hopeful.
And then once she had passed, how well or how poorly did your dad handle it?
Dad handled it pretty poorly.
Yeah.
My parents were very much in love until,
Mm-hmm.
well, always really, even up until my dad passed. So he handled it, poorly. When you're married to somebody for 40 plus years, you tend to, have a very symbiotic relationship, with each other. And,
Yeah.
that was a big void for my dad. He was depressed, he was sad, he was, lost. So, going back to your, initial question about grief, I found myself very much, trying to help him, with his grief, rather than really dealing with my own.
Okay. And then ultimately he gets sick and you become caretaker again.
Yes. So dad actually got diagnosed back in 2011, so about 11 years ago now. So he was sick during the whole time, but very manageable. After my mom passed, his disease, and I think with everything else, just the depression, the sadness, that certainly compounded for him. And yeah, we became caretakers of him for his last few years.
Scott Gegerson's my guest. Scott, I've dealt with enough families in 42 years of priesthood to know that when a parent gets sick, there are usually two ways of dealing with this. The kid who steps up to the plate and does what you did, and then there are others who disappear. I mention that because I'm wondering, what is it in you, or did you even know it was in you, that had the capacity to say, no, my job is to stay, to work it out, to be here for them, and not to pass the buck?
That's a great question. I mean, I think I'll give my parents a plug here. I mean, it's how I was
Mm.
raised. We were raised in a family where my dad was a physician, my mother was a school teacher, so they were very much involved in the community and civil service. And it was always something that was imparted on my sister and myself to just be good people.
Yeah.
Take care of each other, take care of your family. We were raised Roman Catholic, as you well know, so a lot of the teachings that we got through the church, very much aligned with that.
Hmm.
And when they got sick, well, let me take a step back. I saw my mother help her parents out, my grandparents, as they
Ah,
got older.
okay.
She was very much involved with their well-being and taking care of them. Um, so for me, it just wasn't an option. I just didn't really think, one way or the other. I was local. They were, all virtually in the same, towns. So,
Hmm.
just to be there was kind of second nature.
Now, for those, namely all of our listeners and watchers who will never have the privilege of knowing them, Andrew and Lorraine, why were they people that you love so much? What was there about them that they did right in raising you?
Sure. So my father came from a long line of physicians. My great grandfather, my grandfather, and my dad were all physicians, and just very much involved in the community where they practiced, which was in Brooklyn. I've met people, patients of my father, in later years that have always said that the same thing. He was just such a nice and kind man. He had a great bedside manner as a physician. And he carried that through to how he raised my sister and I. He was a very calm and loving man, not easily, annoyed, very tolerant. And a lot of those traits were just so refreshing to grow up with. He was always present, whether it be sporting events or after school events. He was even present in my adult life, very much so, providing advice. And my mother was kind of the same but different. My mother was she was a phenomenal leader. She was a school teacher, but then ultimately became a school administrator. She grew up in a very rigid household. My grandfather was a World War II veteran, and probably up until the day he died, had a military mind about him. And she grew up very much, in that sense. And she was the disciplinarian for my sister and I, but in a very loving way, and always there to, give us whatever tools we needed to succeed. And they were both, a yin and yang, in their relationship, and both had, extremely positive, qualities about them, which, I think, just in life, Monsignor, you kind of take, the best of what you learn from people and try to morph that into your own way of doing things.
We're talking to Scott Gegerson. We're talking about the experience of losing both parents in short order and what he did with that in terms of transforming it into loving service to others. But let me ask you this question because I often wonder how each family handles it. But my dad passed away in 2005, and then my mother moved in with my sister, who took care of her for 14 years. But I sensed along the way that after 14 years, it was probably not the best thing for my sister's marriage that she was a caretaker all that time. So for the past 4 years, my 102-year-old mom has been my responsibility. But I mention that to you because I was so aware, watching my brother-in-law and my sister, of the demands of taking care of parents. And when you were going through this experience of taking care of your parents, you're a married guy, right?
Yes.
So how in the world do you try to make sense of, I got to be there for my parents, but I've also got this new family. How did you handle it, Scott?
So it's difficult. It's definitely, it takes its toll on a marriage and a relationship. I think that you just try to make decisions that are the best for everybody. The best for the children involved, the
Mhm.
best for in my case it was my father, that had lived with us. It's a balancing act.
Yeah, yeah.
We would joke sometimes that it was like having, a third child, with, a lot of demands and a lot of, needs, but in a very different and much more, serious respect. So,
Hmm.
um, yeah, it's certainly something that was difficult, and
Yeah,
those ramifications still live on.
no doubt about that. We're talking Scott. Scott, the experience I had of someone in my parish, wonderful girl named Cara. Mom suffers from breast cancer and then passes away. And this beautiful young girl, college girl, decides, rather than give into the experience of loss and let it go at that, I'm going to spend a lot of my time doing whatever I can to fundraise and educate on the experience of breast cancer for others. What young Cara is doing, you've been doing for quite a while in terms of trying to help people understand the challenges of the particular cancers that afflicted your parents, doing important fundraising. I'm just wondering, how did you come to decide, and what's precisely gave you the energy, devotion, and courage to say, I'm not just going to mourn my parents, I'm going to do something positive to help others so that maybe others don't have to suffer the way they did?
Yeah, yeah. Well, good for Cara. I commend people that do that. And my first introduction into these various charities that I'm involved with today was as a user, in the sense where the Leukemia Lymphoma Society, as an example, I would call up their hotline after a doctor's appointment and explain to them that I heard this word that has way too many syllables to pronounce, and they would give me, a nice email and an explanation about it, and just little tidbits. So as my parents' disease progressed, and as the doctor's appointments started to stack up, and the confusion and all that that surrounds it, I used them as a resource. And once they passed, I started to say, well, what can I do now to help others? Because I would have conversations with friends or clients of mine that may be dealing with some sort of disease or cancer, and I would say, this helped me through the process that I went through. And they said, oh, I would never even think of doing that. A small example, Monsignor, is, of course, do this with a physician's consent, but I would ask the doctor if it would be okay if I would record the doctor's appointment. This way, if there's anything lost or what have you, I can research it on my own time. And in doing that, I've said that to a lot of other people as well, and it's been a huge help to them. So I started to get this understanding that I don't want people to have to experience what I went through, or at least if I can give them some knowledge that helped me along the way, maybe that'll put them a step or two ahead of where I started out in being a caretaker for my family. And of course, the charities are just great platforms to do that. I'm involved with a number that deal specifically with cancer, to help patients and caregivers, and spread awareness, because that to me is just extremely important now.
I get, probably everyone who listens to a program like this gets all sorts of approaches for charity giving. And certainly every year, probably since I was a kid, I've been getting mailings from the American Cancer Society. How do you determine if something's just a big and cumbersome bureaucracy that eats money as opposed to organizations that actually accomplish something?
Sure. So there's a little tool called Charity Navigator. You can see
Okay.
kind of the grades of the charity. And what do I mean by grades? Well, how much of your dollar of your donation actually goes to the cause?
Hmm.
Because obviously a charity, they have staff, they have lights that they got to keep on, they have, people that they have to pay.
Right.
And a lot of that, is not really known that well by the public. So you want to make sure that you're of course, dealing with a charity where a large portion of your donation actually goes to the cause. But then what is the cause? So as an
Mm.
example, Leukemia Lymphoma Society, they have three main, components. They have advocacy, they have research, and they have, patient care. So those three causes is essentially where your dollar goes. Now, for me, one of the biggest important aspects of my donation is towards that research component. They've just done a tremendous amount of research and progressing cures for not only blood cancers, but because blood runs throughout us, many other diseases as well, such as bone cancer, breast cancer, liver cancer, etc. So for me, it was a very just almost a no-brainer as to how well this charity was run, what they're actually doing with those dollars, and then the progress that you could actually see. I saw it during my parents' diagnosis. Treatments that were not available initially were then in trial stage, and then even during my parents' treatment became at home drugs or pills that they could take. So seeing that progress was also pretty eye opening.
Now, let me ask you, when people get their diagnosis, any family, they go into, most families I find go into a time of chaos. How do you advise people to stay sane when everything's up in the air? I'm even wondering about people who are running to doctors all the time. So do they remember to pay their bills? Do they remember to take care of the basics of human living? Like, how do you stay rooted and sane in the midst of a frightening and sometimes overwhelming diagnosis?
Sure, sure. So, I'm sure you deal a lot of this, with a lot of this, just being a pastor and
Yeah.
a spiritual leader. I think the common thread is really anxiety, right? I mean, people just don't
Hmm.
know, or something's new to them. It's very scary to them, so the anxiety level just builds. I always found that information, and other people that can kind of listen and either be a source of information or a shoulder to cry on is just a tremendous help, and as it was for me. Again, hearing terms and diagnosis that I just had no idea what they were,
Right.
that was scary, and you don't know what this means, and then you start to go on the computer and research it yourself. And as we all know, the information could be, the full spectrum. It could be a death sentence, or it could be extremely curable. And what you want to do is just, start to gather that information, talk to people, talk to physicians. A piece of advice that was given to me a long time ago is that, when I'm in the room with the doctor, whether myself as the patient or if I'm there as a caregiver, the doctor is essentially being paid by our insurance. So we're the client, they're the provider. I'm going to get all my questions answered. It's an intimidating, dynamic oftentimes for people because of this new language that they're hearing. But if you can gather information beforehand, if you can prepare yourself, ask the right questions. If you don't understand something, I'm sorry, doctor, can you explain that again to me so I understand it?
Yeah.
That to me kind of reduced the anxiety level. So, if people can kind of go in there with that type of mindset, I always found that to be very helpful.
That's great advice, Scott. I'm thinking a priest friend of mine goes to the doctor and usually hears half of what's said. Even the
Yeah.
idea you mentioned of either taping the conversation or having someone with you who can listen with you and explain later on what they thought they heard, as opposed to what you heard alone in the midst of your confusion. I got to ask a more spiritual question, if you don't mind. Scott Gegerson's our guest. Scott, when you go through these incredibly hard times, and you were terrific to your parents, you helped them both to go through this passage of life to death. But I'm just wondering, like, they were good people, you're good people. Was there a period of time, maybe it even goes on, where you do much shaking of your fist in God's face to say, I'm not liking what you allowed to happen. I don't think God makes these things happen, but I think we can say, hey, you could have made it better. You're God after all. Did you go through any kind of time when you were ticked off at God for what happened?
Of course, of course.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that I was ticked off at God. I would say that I was just, ticked off in general.
Yeah.
I certainly asked the question, in the back of the cathedral of to, why me, why us? And
Yeah.
Monsignor, I look back on that now, and I've changed my thought around that. I don't think that, to your point, that God necessarily does anything to us.
Hmm.
What I think is that, God really just gives us all the tools that we need, and us as
Mm.
humans, we make of that what we will. Okay, so
Yeah.
given these set of circumstances, what did I do with it? What can I do with it? Can I, allow it to bury me and be upset and depressed and not take care of my children or my career?
Mm.
Or, can I turn it into a positive? Because as well as I do that most people don't have perfect lives. We don't get through this without any sort of tragedy or any sort of setbacks. So I'm just a big believer that that can define us, not necessarily what the setback or what the tragedy is, but how
Hmm.
we deal with it.
Scott Gegerson's our guest. Scott is also, aside from being a wonderful financial guy and a wonderful son, obviously, is also a parent himself. So I'm wondering, with Jack, with Ella, these two beautiful children, have you figured out a right or wrong way to explain the mystery of sickness and death?
It's tough. My daughter Ella, who's going to be 9, she remembers full well when both of my parents got sick and ultimately they're passing. She doesn't like to talk about it. It certainly has affected her.
Mm.
She knows that they're in heaven. We've certainly explained what heaven is, but for a young child, that's very difficult. She does attend Catholic schools, so she's getting an education around that, and certainly we'll bring that home and answer questions.
Hmm.
But it's interesting. There's we do little things like if we see a red cardinal fly across the backyard. My mother was a redhead, so we kind of
Mm.
equate that sign as in her memory. So they understand what they can understand, and we certainly try to help them if they do have any questions. But it's I'm 43 months senior, and it's still a mystery to me, right? So it's certainly
Yeah.
difficult waters to navigate with young children, but they get it. They know that they're not coming back, but they know that their memory and their spirit lives on.
And that they will see them again. Scott, I promise this will be my last question, but it's important, I think, for a lot of us. And actually, as a priest, it happens to us too sometimes, less so now because of the mess sometimes the church has made of its own situation. But there certainly was a time where we were put on a pedestal and people just took what we said at face value, didn't question us. I'm kind of glad. I think it's healthy that people are questioning the church about some things. But I mention that because there are other gods in our culture, and those gods are called doctors. Were you intimidated by doctors when you needed them for your parents? And what should be our disposition toward the doctor? He or she is usually brilliant and informed, but they're also human and they can make mistakes. With two parents to care for, and coming from a family of doctors yourself, how do you approach doctors? How should we approach doctors who care for the people we love?
Sure. So, again, growing up in a generational, family involved with medicine, it
Mm.
was something that I was certainly used to. I remember going to my dad's office as a kid and just being around, that environment, consistently. But to answer your question, even given that upbringing and my experience, I was absolutely intimidated,
Yeah.
by doctors. And I think for my case, oncology is a whole field of medicine in and of itself that, is very confusing. And then, of course, there's, other things that can happen in terms of general medicine from the effects of a cancer diagnosis.
Yeah.
So, cardiac issues, pulmonary issues, et cetera. Um, I think, to answer your question, how should we deal with this? It's a very high anxiety situation because people are scared. People, might not have a level of education that might be not may or may not be on par with a physician. So it could be very confusing, and a lot of things can be misunderstood. I think just understanding that the doctor-patient relationship is exactly that. The doctor is there, he or she is there to help the patient, help the caregiver. Okay, if the caregiver or the patient does not feel as though that they're being helped, you have to be your own advocate. I think that's the biggest thing that I learned is that you use the term gods. I would not say that, but certainly people that we look for advice about our own lives and about our own well-being. We put them on that proverbial pedestal so that whatever they say is law. But that might not be the case because we tend to think that they are our advocates as patients and caregivers, but they're human. They have 10 other patients to see in the next hour. They have to write up some reports. They have to call their wife back or their husband back. They have to pick the kids up from soccer practice. So, they have a lot of the same things going on that we have as well. So to be your own advocate, to have somebody there that could also act as your advocate is extremely helpful. To say, I'm sorry, Dr. So-and-so, I'm not understanding what you're telling me. Can you explain it in simpler terms? Or is there somewhere else that I can get this information? What other resources do you have for me that can help me explain this? Is there a social worker that I can speak to? All of these things in changing your mindset of being your own advocate and getting what you want out of that interaction is extremely important.
I'd like to thank Scott Gegerson for being with us. And he, like my younger friend, Cara, has taken a horrible, tragic, heartbreaking situation and decided, I'm going to do something so that others who suffer through what my parents did will suffer less. And to take a negative situation and make it a positive is not something everybody can do. But Scott, you've done that, and you've helped many people already and will continue to. Thank you for being on the program, but thank most importantly for the way in which you took grief and disappointment and heartbreak and turned it into something life-giving. I wish every one of us faced with a similar challenge would have the courage, insight, wisdom, and goodness of heart to do the same. Thank you so much, Scott.
Thank you, Monsignor, for having me, and thank you for allowing me to spread this awareness. I think it's so important, and great seeing you.
As we end today's program, I want to thank you all for being with us. If you need to contact me, you can reach me at personallyspeakingpodcast@gmail.com. We're also on Facebook at Personally Speaking with Monsignor Jim Lisante. We're also now on Instagram at Personally Speaking Podcast. I'm privileged to serve as host and executive producer, Personally Speaking. Our producer is Lisa Jandovitz. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll be with you again next time on Personally Speaking.